The stone floor is cold beneath your feet as you stand in Westminster Abbey on this gray November morning in Stosa 396. You are a witness to something that will be whispered about for centuries, a royal wedding unlike any England has ever seen. The incense burns thick in the air, and through the haze you watch as King Richard II enters, his golden crown catching the filtered light through stained glass. Beside him walks what appears to be a child, so small her hand disappears entirely into his gloved palm. She cannot be more than 6 years old, this little French princess in her elaborate gown heavy with pearls. Her dark eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear as she gazes up at the soaring Gothic arches above her. Before we step deeper into this extraordinary story, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching from. It amazes me endlessly that we can connect across continents, exploring these ancient mysteries together. This is the marriage of Isabella of Valois to Richard II of England. Sealed on the last day of October 1396 in Calais, and it represents one of medieval Europe's most audacious diplomatic gambles. Isabella was born November 9, 1389. The eldest daughter of Charles VI of France, king, whose bouts of madness would shape his daughter's understanding of power's fragility from her earliest years. Richard, at 29, was a widower still grieving his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, who had died of plague the year before. The marriage was designed to end 100 Years' War, or at least pause it long enough for an entire generation to forget what peace felt like. France offered an astronomical dowry of 800,000 francs and a 28-year truce. England, exhausted from decades of warfare, accepted. The price was a child bride so young that even medieval chroniclers noted the arrangement with unease. But here is what the treaties and dowries could not capture. Isabella's childhood in the Louvre Palace was marked by terror and confusion. Her father would be lucid and loving one day, bouncing her on his knee, showering her with gifts. The next, he would be found cowering in corners, screaming about invisible assassins, or standing motionless for hours, convinced his body was made of glass that would shatter if he moved. Palace servants learned to hustle the children away during these episodes, but Isabella's large dark eyes absorbed everything: the fear, the whispers, the understanding that power and sanity were not guaranteed, even for kings. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was calculating and ambitious, managing the kingdom during her husband's episodes while simultaneously evaluating which of her children could be used to secure France's future. Isabella learned early that love and utility were not opposites in royal families. They were inseparable. When French ambassadors first proposed the marriage to Richard's court, the English king resisted, not because of Isabella's age. Such marriages, though usually involving older girls, were common, but because replacing Anne felt like betrayal. Anne had been called Good Queen Anne, beloved by commoners for her charity and gentleness. But Richard's advisors were relentless. The king needed an heir, and more urgently, England needed peace. The treasury was depleted. The nobility was fractious. A marriage to France's eldest princess could transform decades of bloodshed into alliance. When Richard finally saw the miniature portrait of Isabella sent from Paris, something in his expression softened. Court observers noted this was not the face of a man seeking a political asset. This was the face of someone seeing a child who would need protection. The negotiations stretched across months, every detail scrutinized. Isabella would keep her French servants. She would maintain correspondence with her family. And written explicitly into the treaty, the marriage would not be consummated until she reached physical maturity. This was not unusual for child marriages of the era, but the fact that it was formalized in diplomatic language suggests how aware both kingdoms were of the arrangement's extraordinary nature. Meanwhile, in Paris, 6-year-old Isabella played with dolls, unaware that seamstresses were already constructing her trousseau, and tutors were teaching her English phrases she would need at a court she could not yet imagine. The wedding ceremony in Calais was intimate but heavy with symbolism. Isabella wore cloth of gold, so heavy with embroidery she needed help walking. Richard knelt to her level to exchange rings, and when she seemed frightened by the assembled nobles staring at her, he gently lifted her chin and spoke to her in soft tones that witnesses strained to hear. They were pronounced husband and wife, and with those words, a 6-year-old became Queen of England. A year later came the grand coronation at Westminster Abbey, where crowds crushed forward to glimpse the famous child queen, and several people died in the chaos. Isabella processed through London in a litter decorated with English roses and French fleur-de-lis. Wearing a crown specially made for her small head, smiling and waving as she'd been taught, understanding almost nothing of the English blessings shouted from the streets. What no one could have predicted was how genuinely Richard would embrace his role as her protector. He installed her in lavish apartments at Westminster Palace, staffed with a carefully balanced household of French and English attendants. He visited her regularly, bringing gifts: exotic birds from Ireland, illuminated manuscripts from Oxford, musical instruments crafted by London's finest artisans. He seemed to delight in her company, and she began to look forward to his visits, greeting him with a mixture of formality and the affection a child shows a beloved guardian. This was not the predatory arrangement modern minds might imagine. This was a king fulfilling a promise to protect a child until she came of age, and finding unexpected joy in that responsibility. Isabella proved remarkably adaptable. She learned English quickly, her tutors noting her sharp intelligence and curiosity. She made friends among the children at court, particularly Margaret Holland, daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret was only 2 years older, but seemed infinitely sophisticated to Isabella, teaching her English games, explaining court hierarchies, and warning her about political undercurrents. Why do the English nobles watch each other so carefully? Isabella once asked Margaret as they practiced needlework in the garden. Margaret explained that Richard's reign had been marked by conflict with his nobility almost from the beginning. There had been a major rebellion when he was young, and he'd never entirely forgiven those who opposed him. "The king is powerful now," Margaret said, "but power in England must be shared with the nobles. Some think your marriage shows he prefers negotiation to conquest, and they consider that weakness." Isabella absorbed these lessons with the seriousness of someone beginning to understand that her existence had political weight. She began watching court interactions with new awareness, noticing how conversations shifted when she appeared, how certain nobles fell silent when Richard entered rooms, how even her French ladies-in-waiting chose their words carefully. Her education expanded beyond typical feminine accomplishments. Richard insisted she learn to read and write in both French and English. Her tutors included some of the kingdom's finest scholars. She studied history, the chronicles of English and French kings, learning about the figures whose actions had created the world she inhabited. One of her favorite lessons involved maps. Her tutor, Master William, would spread great parchments across her study chamber floor, showing her the extent of both kingdoms, explaining how geography had shaped centuries of conflict. Isabella would kneel beside these maps, tracing coastlines with her finger. "See here, Your Grace," Master William would say, pointing to the narrow waters between Dover and Calais. "This small strip has been both bridge and barrier. Your marriage represents the hope that it might finally serve only as a bridge." For 3 years, Isabella's life unfolded with remarkable stability. She grew from a tiny child into a more confident girl, her English fluent, her understanding of court life sophisticated. Westminster's massive stone walls became familiar rather than intimidating. But in early 1399, everything began to change. Conversations stopped more abruptly when she appeared. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged worried glances. Even Margaret Holland seemed distracted and anxious. Richard's visits became less frequent, and when he did come, he appeared preoccupied, staring out windows toward the Thames as if expecting ships on the horizon. The truth was catastrophic. Richard's cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, whom Richard had exiled the previous year, had returned to England with an army. He claimed he'd come only to reclaim his inheritance, but his true intention was obvious to everyone. The English nobles, many of whom had long resented Richard's rule, began flocking to Henry's banner. The carefully constructed stability that had allowed Isabella to feel safe was crumbling with terrifying speed. Isabella first understood the severity when she woke one morning to find several of her English ladies waiting gone. By afternoon, she could hear shouting from courtyards below, and when she looked out, she saw armed men wearing unfamiliar livery. Margaret Holland burst into Isabella's chambers at dusk, her face drained of color. "You must pack only what you cannot lose. We leave Westminster tonight." Isabella's breath caught. "Where are we going?" "To the Tower," Margaret whispered. "The King says it is for your safety." But Isabella knew the Tower of London was safety and danger in the same stone walls. The journey through the dark streets felt nothing like the proud processions she remembered. Guards flanked the small covered carriage, swords drawn, the city around them humming with unrest. No cheerful market, cries only urgent murmurs and distant shouts carried on the wind. Her new rooms in the Tower were comfortable yet undeniably prison-like. Windows were barred, entrances guarded, and most of her attendants dismissed. Isolation settled over her like a second cloak. When Richard finally came to see her, Isabella hardly recognized him. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes exhausted and frantic. He knelt before her as he had years earlier, but the gesture now looked like defeat rather than affection. "My dear child," he murmured, "our circumstances grow uncertain. Many question my right to rule. Are you still king?" Isabella asked, steady despite her terror. "For now," he said bitterly, "but Henry gathers support. I fear I may not protect you for much longer." In that moment, Richard spoke to her not as a husband to a child bride, but as a leader to someone who needed truth. Isabella listened as he explained Henry Bolingbroke's challenge and the nobles who had abandoned the crown. "What will happen to me?" she asked quietly. Richard had no answer. For weeks, Isabella lived cut off from the world, hearing only fractured whispers. Then one morning, unfamiliar boots echoed through the corridor. Men in red rose livery entered Henry's colors. Behind them came Henry himself, now king. Isabella curtsied, heart thudding. He studied her carefully. "Your Grace," he said, still using her title, "your future depends on many things: your father's actions, my counsel's advice, and your own conduct." With that, Isabella understood her new reality. She was no longer a child queen learning her duties, but a valuable prisoner whose existence might tip the balance between peace and war. She survived those early months with quiet brilliance, polite, reserved, never careless. Her ladies reminded her, "You are still queen in the eyes of France. As long as the marriage stands, so does your value." Then came the news that shattered her fragile stability. Richard was dead. Whether by starvation or blade, no one dared say. Isabella felt the loss sharply. She had not loved him as a wife, but he had been kind, her protector in a foreign world. With his death, a chapter of her life closed forever. And the child who had come to England full of hope understood she now stood entirely alone. Isabella of Valois entered the political world long before she could understand it. By early 1400, the 10-year-old former Queen of England found herself at the center of tense negotiations. Henry IV's government offered her a stark ultimatum. She could return to France only if she acknowledged Henry as England's rightful king and renounced all claims tied to her marriage to Richard. Accepting would mean dismissing her 3 years as queen as meaningless. Refusing meant risking indefinite imprisonment. But the choice was ultimately taken from her hands. During a rare period of lucidity, her father, Charles VI of France, demanded her immediate return and warned that further delays would be taken as hostility. Unwilling to provoke renewed war, Henry's council agreed to send Isabella home. The terms were left deliberately vague, letting each side decide whether she departed freely or by force. Her journey back to France in the summer of 1401 was bittersweet. England had become her home, the gardens where she played, the English poems she had learned, the friends she would never see again. Yet she was returning to a family and court that had grown foreign during her 5 years abroad. She spoke French with an English lilt, preferred English dress, and had to relearn French etiquette. The child who had left Paris at 6 returned at 11, shaped by experiences her relatives could scarcely imagine. Her reunion with her parents was overshadowed by her father's worsening illness. Charles VI, lost in delusions and terrors, did not recognize her at first. When his mind cleared weeks later, he seemed bewildered by her presence, as though he had forgotten she had ever been a queen. Her mother, Queen Isabel, greeted her warmly, but with political calculation, immediately considering how Isabella's unique position might serve French interests. Caught between two identities, Isabella struggled. She was French by birth, but England had been her home, and she felt lingering loyalty to the country that had treated her kindly. When advisors questioned her about England's defenses or Henry's support, she answered cautiously, never betraying her conscience but never providing details that could endanger her former home. The French court, anxious and divided, was a dangerous place for someone with mixed loyalties. In 1403, a proposal arrived that would alter her future: marriage to Charles, Duke of Orleans, her cousin and one of the most distinguished nobles in France. 29 years old, but youthful in manner, he had treated Isabella with kindness since her childhood. The match was politically convenient and personally promising. Charles offered not only stability but genuine respect, speaking to Isabella as an equal whose experiences had shaped her into someone remarkable. For the first time, Isabella felt drawn to the prospect of marriage. By now nearly 14, she was no longer a child. Charles's passion for art, literature, and politics aligned with her own growing interests. Their conversations convinced her she was choosing a partner, not being assigned a guardian. They married in June 1406 in a splendid ceremony at Notre Dame. Unlike her small diplomatic wedding to Richard, this celebration displayed the full splendor of the French crown. Isabella, now 16, walked confidently down the aisle in deep blue silk. No longer the frightened girl forced into queenship, but a young woman shaping her own future. Her early years with Charles were among her happiest. His court at Beauvais became a center of culture and learning, and Isabella flourished there. She patronized artists, commissioned manuscripts, and fostered intellectual exchanges influenced by her experiences in England. The birth of their first child, Jean, in 1407, deepened her joy. Determined to offer her daughter a childhood free from political manipulation, she embraced motherhood with tenderness and resolve. But France was descending into civil war. In late 1407, Charles's father, Louis of Orleans, was murdered on the orders of the Duke of Burgundy. The assassination ripped apart the fragile peace of the kingdom, transformed Isabella's life. Charles inherited not only his father's titles, but also his enemies. Their once joyful household was replaced by layers of security, guarded travel, and constant fear. Isabella met the crisis with surprising strength. While Charles fought to defend Orleans' interests, she managed estates, negotiated alliances, and organized supplies. Her compassion extended beyond her own lands. She arranged safe passage for refugees and supported charitable efforts during the conflict. Many began to see her not merely as a duchess, but as a wise and benevolent leader. The birth of her second child, Charles, in 1408 offered brief peace, but danger remained everywhere. Her third child, Marguerite, was born in 1409 after a difficult pregnancy that nearly killed her. Isabella survived, but her health never fully recovered. Chronic weakness and respiratory illness plagued her, and physicians warned that another pregnancy would be fatal. Despite their worries, she and Charles remained devoted to each other, finding solace in shared work and quiet companionship. As her condition worsened, Isabella prepared carefully for the future. She arranged the education and guardianship of her children, put her affairs in order, and continued her duties as long as she could. Even in decline, she faced life with courage. Isabella of Valois died on September 13, 1409, at just 20 years old. Her funeral drew mourners from across Europe: peasants, scholars, nobles, even English merchants who remembered the gentle child queen. They came not only to honor her rank, but to honor a woman whose life, though brief, had been marked by resilience, kindness, and unwavering dignity. Her children and husband carried forward her legacy of culture, compassion, and steadfast leadership. Isabella had lived through upheaval, exile, and war, yet refused to be defined by the limitations imposed on her. In an age that expected royal women to be silent symbols, she became instead a thoughtful actor in her own story, leaving behind a legacy that echoed long after her death.